Hey everybody, welcome back to Ask an Addiction Specialist. You're here with Odie and Bob. This is Odie Martinez. I'm Bob Weathers. I'm really happy to have you with us today. My background is in psychology and my work is in recovery coaching. I just came from a group at Beginnings Treatment Centers who are one of our sponsors for our weekly presentations, along with Therapy Cable. And we have in the studio today helping us, Austin Armstrong is faithfully manning all manner of technology as we speak, and Odie's his helper during the week, and then he helps me when I'm here. So I'm really happy for you to join us today. As always, we are happy to have you be with us, and I invite you to submit questions. Austin will moderate and take your questions and forward those to Odie and me, so please feel free to submit questions as we move forward. Just by way of quick review, last week we discussed integral recovery practice, and how we talked about integral recovery. If we can just translate it as being, it's a holistic approach to recovery. Integral basically is a synonym for holistic, and we're looking at recovery from multiple perspectives. In fact, I'm aware of it this week leading groups, as I'll introduce myself as having a background in psychology, and a good bit of the exposure that our clients have that are in early recovery is to 12-step support groups. And the focus of many 12-step support groups like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous is that addiction is a spiritual problem requiring a spiritual solution. And how I'll introduce myself is I'll say, that's typically what I won't be talking about. It's not that that's not of great value to me, it's just that my focus will be on more psychological issues relevant to addiction and to recovery. And so we'll talk more from a psychological perspective. And I'll also say, if I were a physician like my dad was, I'd probably be talking about medical perspectives on addiction, which is to say that biological perspectives, psychological perspectives, social perspectives, cultural perspectives, spiritual perspectives, all of those pertain to addiction because it's a complex phenomenon. There's no single, simple little answer to what addiction is, nor to what recovery requires of us. In the spirit of last week's presentation on integral or holistic practice, looking at addiction from these multiple perspectives, I had a chance this week, thanks to dear Austin. He recommended to me that I check out a podcast. What he didn't tell me is it is a 3-hour podcast, Austin. And so I am now in the third hour. I am making it, Austin. And some of you may have seen this because it's gone fairly viral. It features the British journalist and author Johann Hari. I've got a photograph of him here. I highly recommend you going on YouTube and just typing in Johann Hari. If you want to go specifically to the podcast that Austin recommended to me, type in Joe Rogan as well, and it's his regular podcast where he interviews Johann Hari. It just came out 2 weeks ago in February of 2019, and it's had a lot of people viewing it. Several 100,000 people have viewed it. In fact, I looked at the first podcast I viewed of Johann Hari some years ago. Came out a few years ago. It was a TED Talk. And it has 11 million viewers. So there's been a lot of people that have viewed Johann Hari. He's had a lot of impact, not only in his writing. He has 2 books out. One of them is specific to addiction, Chasing the Scream. And the second book is related to that because it addresses depression. And depression and addiction oftentimes go hand in hand. The second book is called Lost Connections. So I highly recommend those books. And maybe to get a sense of whether you kind of like where he travels, I recommend these podcasts. So Johann Hari, he's British, his father's from Switzerland, hence his Swiss-sounding name, but he's got a very strong British accent, and he's sharp as can be, and really well-studied, articulate, passionate, deeply caring about addiction and recovery. And if you've seen him, you'll recognize the next phrase, which is the title of today's podcast. At the end of his TED Talk, he finishes it in a very powerful way. He's a great speaker. And he says, the opposite of addiction is not what you think it is. Most people think the opposite of addiction is sobriety. And there's a way that's true, but he says the opposite of addiction is, pregnant pause, connection. And so there you get really a centerpiece of all of Johann Hari's research that he's done, is that what he's discovered is that that people become addicted and stay addicted when they feel disconnected. And that's really the theme of our podcast today, is looking at connection. If you've been with us, oh, by the way, this is a shameless plug for going to our YouTube archive of Ask Addiction Specialist videos. You can also find these through our Facebook group. You can also go to Beginnings Treatment Centers, and there's a podcast archive there of the last over a year now of podcasts. There's been a number of threads throughout all of our podcasts, but one of them has been looking at the impact of disconnection on addiction. And we've talked about disconnection specifically in terms of shame. Shame has kind of been the core term that we've worked from every possible angle. As a quick review with my friend Odie, who's been with me through this, what is shame, Odie, in your own words?
Shame is...
I'm covering my notes.
Shame is
what is it to feel shame?
Is the feeling that, not that I did something wrong, but that I am.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah. So it moves beyond guilt, which would be I've done something wrong, into there's something defective, broken about me, which is really as good a definition of shame as I can think of. And there's not a one of us that can't relate to that. It's a universal human emotion. It's extremely stressful to endure, and it's highly correlated not only with those that are in active addiction, because there's so much shame associated with that. In fact, today in the group I just came from, we were talking about what it was like. One individual was talking about what it's like to have relapsed to alcohol, and alcohol wasn't his primary substance of abuse, but when he drank, he talked about there was the initial euphoria that came from drinking the alcohol, and then what set in was the guilt and the shame for having gotten off track, because he realized this made him much more at risk of a much more serious, more severe addiction to a life-threatening drug, and in fact he relapsed to that drug. And he was talking about how that shame was kind of midway between that first drink and relapse into his more familiar addiction with an opiate. So if we think about shame as two sides of a coin, one of those is just exactly what Odie just talked about. The first side that we talk about, well, let me just talk about that, is the feeling that there's something wrong with me, something broken about me. And so shame undermines my self-esteem. The flip side of that coin is that shame is a social emotion, and the flip side of that is if I'm broken or you're broken, then that means people probably aren't going to like us.
Right.
And so we experience not only rejection of ourselves, or to use Johann Hari's term, I feel disconnected from myself. It also disconnects me from others.
Yeah.
So there's a sense of interpersonal disconnection as well as intrapersonal disconnection. So what's the solution? How are we doing over here, Austin? Are there comments up here? Okay, all right, just checking. Okay, all right. We're a team in real time here, you guys. I love working with Austin and Odie. We've been together for a good long spell now, and it's been good. And so we know each other and work well together. If shame or disconnection, well, let's just go back to Johann Hari. If he says the opposite of addiction is connection, and if what we've been talking about over the last year is talking about disconnection, which is the opposite of connection, disconnection, which is highly related to shame, then what might be the antidote to the disconnection that keeps me in addiction? And so what I want to cite here is another dear soul, a supervisor of mine who's deeply impacted my thought about addiction, Dr. Bonnie Badenoch. I have a photo of her here for you. And Dr. Bonnie Badenoch was the one who introduced me to the idea of a corrective emotional experience as applied to addiction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a moment, but let me say a little bit more about Bonnie. Do you have a photo of Bonnie? Bring up here so people can see her. She's a kindly spirit. She's written, thank you. She's written several books now. The first book she wrote was the one that led me to her. I began reading the book and I reached out to her and she agreed to supervise me. Her first book was called Being a Brainwise Therapist. The subtitle of it is A Practical Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology. And I'm sure that you're wondering what that means, aren't
What
you?
does that mean? Yeah.
Thank you, Odie. Interpersonal neurobiology, if you break it down, it's just what it says. It's looking at the neurobiology, which is our brain biology primarily, in relationship to others. Interpersonal neurobiology. So how is my brain impacted by my relationship to you and vice versa? And she's written a book for therapists so that therapists would be able to be not only familiar with how our brains, our social interactions affect our brains and vice versa, but helping therapists to be able to translate that to their work with clients. And Bonnie helped me immensely with that. Here's a photograph of Bob and Bonnie together. Dear soul, this is an interview with her a few years back. And in my work with Bonnie, she shared with me, she fleshed out what does it mean to have a corrective emotional experience, which is another technical term from psychology that means kind of what it sounds like. It's an emotional experience with another person that ends up being transformative. It ends up correcting something. So let's talk a little bit about that the way that Bonnie taught me. Bonnie used the metaphor of a railway coupling. And I'm not a train person, but as a boy, I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas. I can remember my cousin Michael had a railroad track that went right behind his house. I don't know how they ever slept at night. It never really once occurred to me when I was a kid. The fun part about that track was that Michael and I would put coins on the tracks. And if you've ever done that, it's really cool what happens. The coins get flattened by the weight of the train, and so you'd have let's say a dime, and it becomes like this big. That's what kids do.
Yeah.
I was 4 or 5 years old, and that was great fun for me. So, but I also remember sitting with Michael in his backyard and watching the trains go by, and sometimes they'd slow down. And what I've noticed is between train cars, something connects them. Well, that connector is what Bonnie's talking about, and it's a coupling that looks kind of like this. They fit kind of tongue and groove is what the metal coupling. So let me take that. I'll supply an image in just a second. Let me take that image. What Bonnie says is that on the heels of psychological trauma, and trauma can manifest in childhood. She's referring to childhood trauma. Childhood trauma can manifest in terms of various forms of abuse. You can think of physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. It can also manifest in terms of neglect or being ignored, like a sense of deprivation. And there's other forms of abuse, but that gives you a sense of what we're talking about. In the presence of trauma, then what relationship closeness or intimacy feels like is danger. And so rather than finding safety in relationship, I've got red alert going on.
Right.
And so closeness or emotional intimacy evokes for me a sense of danger, which makes me want to disconnect from it. And that really ties into what we were talking about with shame, is that there's two aspects of shame that we talked about. Shame leads me to be separated from others. I'm not really connected to others. It also leads me to be separated from myself. And how that works psychologically, that Bonnie talked about, is that if I've been mistreated or neglected as a child, most children will internalize that as something wrong about whom? Themselves. It's not about my parents. Most kids can't afford to imagine that their parents are that incompetent.
Yeah.
It's too scary. It's too disturbing. So the child will internalize a sense that there's something broken about them at the same time that the child doesn't trust the parent. And so the child will feel disconnected from the parent even as they're disconnected from themselves. And what Bonnie is saying is that trauma will lock that in like this. I'm looking at the camera. This is supposed to be a railway coupling between two train cars. It locks in, and it's really hard to pull that apart because it's for survival's sake. Right. If I'm in danger, I want to protect myself, and this is my protection, is that you don't get close. You stay disconnected. Yeah. There's a comment on the screen. Let me pause for a second and take a look at that. I'm going to read this, and we'll see where it goes. Wow, I just realized how much shame extended my relapses in the past. That makes me really happy. If nothing else happened today in this podcast, other than you coming to that realization, that's most excelente. That's great. That's great. These aha experiences, which we'll be talking about later today as well, are really important. Sometimes you hear them talked about in recovery settings as moments of clarity, just like eureka moment. Wow, I just realized how much shame extended my relapses in the past. When I relapsed and had a moment at the beginning of the relapse where I really didn't want to continue, just like the story I shared from today, but the shame was so intense that I couldn't reach out for help and then continued the relapse far longer. That's exactly what this guy was talking about today. I know this personally, this guy did today. You may know it in your own life around addictive behaviors, and certainly this individual does. Thank you. Just pause for just a second. When I relapsed and had a moment at the beginning of the relapse where I really didn't want to continue, there's that moment where you still have a chance of not going over the edge of the falls, but the shame was so intense that you couldn't reach out for help because shame shuts us down. We just established shame isolates us, it disconnects us. And then what you're left with is the stress of all of the shame, and it's nearly impossible not to relapse. We talked today about when you're in that kind of grip, it's almost like a gravitational pull. It's a little bit of a misnomer to say that you're choosing to relapse. And you can track something back and you can say at some point I made a decision, but it's tricky. It's tricky because once you get going that far with that kind of stress circulating through your system, we've talked about this in the past, is that shame is associated with the highest elevations of cortisol. So when I've got that much cortisol and adrenaline running through my system, unless I'm able to reach out, there's another guy in the room today, in the group today, that was able to reach out just yesterday, right on the cusp of relapse, and he realized he couldn't do it alone. And he reached out, and the person he reached out to was in the room, and that person provided support. And I thought that was brilliant. Wow. Psychology calls that co-regulation. If I cannot regulate my own stress, I'm overwhelmed by it, then let me reach out to you, Odie. Is that you be my stress, you be my brain, you be my voice of reason. And that's exactly what was talked about today in the room. So if you can catch it before you go too far, that's great. But once you go past a certain point, that's the place where it's hard to say that you choose for it because choice is kind of out of your hands. It's like it's got its own momentum. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. So it's like that's why groups are helpful.
Yeah,
so
that's
you have
exactly
that support system.
Yeah.
And you're not just kind of treading water on your own.
Yeah.
You go to your group and you know that you can comfortably share whatever you're going through. You'll know you'll get the support that you're looking for.
Yeah, that is the value. That's the strongest value, it seems like to me. I think about it from a psychological perspective, even from a biological perspective, is if you think of where our brains are located, they're located right here in our noggins. But we've talked about this before. They're also located in our hearts. There's a tremendous amount of innervation in our heart area, which is related to connection. And there's also a lot of neural activity in our stomach area that's actually referred to as the gut brain, and it's associated with feelings of safety. You can think of times where you've been in a situation you don't feel safe, and it's like, and we literally say, my gut tells me something's off here. Well, the gut is hardly ever wrong. Okay, it's nice to pay attention to your gut, but there's also another way that our brains locate, and it's between us. And so brain scientists talk about shared brain. Odie and I share brains. We share brains with Austin. Austin shares brains with the world right now. And it gets really serious when you're on the cusp of relapse. I literally need your brain to help supplement me because by definition, that level of craving, moving into active addiction, is a midbrain phenomenon. It's happening between my ears, and that's really the reward center of the brain, which is full-on activated, along with the adrenal axis in the brain, which is related to stress, and it will trump the forebrain, the frontal cortex, which makes decisions about, is this a good idea or not? And if that part of my brain is shut down, could you please be that for me? And I really do mean that quite literally. Odie ends up being auxiliary brain for Bob, specifically auxiliary frontal cortex for Bob, which is the wisdom of the groups. Is that when I'm especially when I'm at risk for relapse, can I reach out to a sponsor? Can I reach out to a peer, somebody who'll guide me through that? And that's exactly what happened in the group today. That's what we were talking about. So thank you for sharing what you just shared. There's an image here of a coupling. Let's see, there it is right there. There's a coupling. Those are two railroad cars, and that metal thing that grasps together, that's the coupling. I'll ask a question for you. In a situation that represents unsafety, the lack of safety, besides the fact that your gut's going to get activated, what happens if you risk intimacy? What happens is that coupling gets particularly activated because it's associated, if I risk intimacy, that's associated with trauma. And so what will happen is I'll actually move into even more of an iron grip with that. Have you ever done those little finger cuffs? What do they call those?
Chinese finger traps.
What is it called?
Chinese finger traps.
Finger traps?
Yeah.
Chinese finger traps? Are they made in China? Is that what they call it?
I don't know.
Okay. How does it work? I haven't done one of those since probably I was a kid with Mike. How do they work?
I think it's the further you put in your finger and then you try to take it out, you can't get it out. You have to, I think, bring it together in order to take it out or something like that.
Okay.
It's been a while.
It reminds me right now of like a cookie jar, putting your hand in a cookie jar. If you reach into a cookie jar and you're little Bobby, you want to pull out 10 cookies? How does that work? It doesn't work very well because the neck is like that. Yeah. You have to get smarter than I was and pull out one at a time. Yeah. And I think those Chinese finger traps, if you pull out fast, which every kid wants to do, it locks down.
Right, yeah.
If you pull out gradually, I think it opens up or it doesn't close down on you. That's what this is like. Right. Okay, that's what this is like. So whether it's a railway coupling or a Chinese finger trap or your hand in a cookie jar, any of those is that it locks down. It locks down in the presence of trauma because intimacy equals trauma. Intimacy equals danger. What would happen if you could find safety? Is it possible to imagine safety? And we're going to talk deeply into this. We're going to do an exercise in a couple minutes. In safety, what happens if I risk intimacy? Now, I'm not talking about danger. I'm talking about safety. Well, the first thing that happens is I probably won't trust it, right? And so I'll lock down like that finger trap. But if there really is authentic safety where I can share something that's very private about my life, something that I feel secretive about or whatever like that, and if I can trust you, there might actually be a releasing, like with the finger trap. There might be a releasing. And in that releasing, Bonnie Badenoch, my teacher, said, in that releasing, there's the possibility of something new to be laid down in the brain. So there's an image of that, of the coupling kind of relaxing. We probably went, but what? There, thank you. The uncoupling, thank you. In the uncoupling, there's a releasing. Can you see that? That's what happens in safety. And so another way to think about this, if in a situation of trauma, intimacy equals danger, in a situation that involves the kind of safety that we're imagining into, intimacy actually doesn't equate with danger. Intimacy actually equates with connection. Intimacy equates with compassion. Intimacy, to use a word that we've used here sometimes, intimacy equates with unshaming. Yeah. So in the presence of, on the heels of trauma, in the presence of intimacy, I feel ashamed, so I shut down. In the presence of safety, maybe I can learn how to let go of that shutdown and begin to open up. So what we're talking about is opening up and then creating a new coupling based on safety. And so this is the essence of healing, is the way that Bonnie talks about it, is if trauma teaches me that intimacy equals danger, then in a healing relationship that involves safety and security, I can begin to experience intimacy as being compassionate and empathic and connecting. Last week we talked about a German lesson. I was tempted to test you, but that feels cruel. It'd be like you testing me on Spanish or something. I'd be up a creek. We talked last week about a story from my high school years where there was a poster on the wall in a German class, the German language lab, and it simply said, Übung macht den Meister, which translates as Übung means practice, macht means makes, den Meister means the master. So literally it means practice makes the master. It's close to what we would say in English, practice makes perfect. Right. Bonnie Badenoch, my supervisor, would put it this way. She says, Bob, what fires together, wires together. And what she means by that is that when the brain fires in a new pattern, for example, there's a relaxation of the former fear around danger, and now I feel safe, is if I can repeat that experience, the brain will actually, as it fires in the direction of safety, the brain will actually begin to wire together. That's the wiring together in a new blueprint. And the blueprint now is intimacy is desirable. Intimacy is where I find connection. Yeah. Intimacy is where I find help, the way that we talked about if you're on the cusp of relapse. Intimacy is where I find compassion. Intimacy is where I find unshaming. It's where I find healing. Yeah. So just as a quick summary, what we're talking about is then in safety, intimacy no longer equals danger. There's an uncoupling. And then with the possibility of repeating that, there's a recoupling or a recoming together. And as Bonnie says, what fires together, wires together. If you keep firing safety with intimacy, pretty soon that habit becomes the new strong coupling. Yeah. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that reminds me of a couple things. Like the first thing that came to mind was testing the waters to see if it's at a good temperature. You know, you put your toe in first. Okay, it feels good. Yeah. And then you get a little bit of the water on your hands, you put it on your ears, and you slowly start going in. And the other thing that it reminded me of
That's a great image.
Was it's like when you start your first, like a job for the first time. Yeah. You know, you're not too familiar with it.
Right.
But slowly you start getting used to the ebb and flow of the workflow of the job. Yeah. Pretty much.
I just got some notes from what you said. You stick your toe in and you put the water on your ears?
More the water on my ears than my toes, but yeah.
Is that right? You put the water in your ears?
Have you ever tried that? Just like
no, in fact, 2 weeks ago, I wish we'd had this conversation 2 weeks ago. I swim most mornings. I swim every morning, except for right now. I swim every morning at a local community pool. Right. And I went there 2 weeks ago, and the heater for the community pool had broken down. I found all this out later.
After you jumped in?
Turns out that every 10 years, about every 6 or 8 years, you have to replace the heater. And they told me later the heater had been there for 10 years. And so I got in the pool, and they said before I went, they actually told me the temperature. But it didn't seem that cold. But I didn't put it on my ears. Okay. I just dived into the pool. And then I came up and I realized there's no one else swimming. So I'm out there swimming in the pool. It's so flippin' cold. In fact, I swam for a half hour just to survive. Right. I was afraid of getting out because I figured I'd just like die of, hypothermia or something. Right. And then I went back. They said it was going to be fixed in a week, so I went back this week to see if it's fixed. I haven't been able to swim since then. It was just crazy. I didn't dip my toe in. It sounds stupid. It is stupid, actually. And I didn't know about this. I just dived in and then realized that whatever temperature they said is really freaking cold. And so I went back this week, and they actually had outside the gate of the community pool, they said, you can come swimming, but they said it's 60 degrees. And I don't know how you guys feel about 60 degrees.
That's too cold, yeah.
It's this side of numbing. I didn't get numb, but I got really cold. And I think if I hadn't swum, I could have died. Anyway, so that's good to know. That's good to know. Good tip. This is a very useful podcast. There's just all kinds of really important information for any of you that are swimmers out there. Odie, thank you. That's a good lesson. Thank you. And then the second thing you said was, in jobs. All of us know what it's like to go into a new job and feel disoriented for a period of time. Exactly. And then you eventually kind of find that. That's exactly the same. You just begin to kind of open up, and over time you begin to find your comfort. But it's hard at the beginning. You have to kind of gut it through at the beginning. Let me give another lesson in addition to the swimming lesson and the work-related lesson. Mm-hmm. This is a Latin lesson. And we're gonna do an exercise in just a moment. This is a Latin lesson, and it's a riff off of the word surprise. The word surprise in Latin derives from two roots. The first part, the prefix is sur, which, like if you think of to surmount something, is to go above something. Sur means above in Latin, and the root for the root of the word prize actually derives from the word that's closest to our word prehension. We don't really use that word alone, but we use apprehension, comprehension. How I think about this is I think about the zoo. When I go to the zoo, I like to watch monkeys. They have a prehensile tail. Do you know what that is? No. So I get to give you a lesson today? Yes. Okay, you gave me a lesson. You really gave me a lesson because I froze my booty off that time. Okay, monkeys have a prehensile tail, and what that means is that they're able to grasp something with their tail.
Okay.
So if you've seen a monkey swing from branch to branch, they're using their hands and their feet, and they're using their tail. It's called a prehensile tail. Well, what prehension or prehensile means in Latin is literally to take or to be taken. So a prehensile tail takes a grip.
Mm-hmm.
You could also say it's to be gripped. So if you look at the etymology of the word surprise, isn't this fascinating?
Mm-hmm.
Surprise means to be taken from above.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To be taken from above.
Right.
So there's an image here. I think Odie's going to bring that up here. There's an image. It means to be taken from above. If you can imagine like a hand pulling you up from above. I love that definition of surprise.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about aha experiences, like the one that the individual was sharing about their experience of relapse and its relationship to shame. All of us have had, I hope, have had aha experiences in relationship to somebody in our life from whom we were with whom we were taken from above.
Right.
And to put this in a different language, you've experienced grace in a way that was surprising. You might have been anticipating judgment or rejection, and instead what you had is you had a hand
Right.
reaching out to pull you up,
Yeah.
pull you up. How this goes in relationship, and I'm setting up an exercise here in just a moment. How this goes in relationship is if you've been used to trauma and rejection and shame, this is like a blast of compassion and forgiveness. To use Johann Hari's term that we introduced earlier, it's moving from addiction to connection. It's moving from what we do in the play. What he's saying is in the experience ongoing of disconnection, we will turn towards addictive props in order to medicate ourselves.
Yeah.
That in the presence of connection, maybe that's the antidote to the addiction that itself is in response to disconnection. So to be taken from above, to have somebody reach out to us with grace, could conceivably be a huge resource, and for some of us, the most significant factor in our own recovery from addiction. I want to go back to Bonnie Badenoch for just one more moment. Bonnie introduced me to a further term, talking about this railway coupling metaphor. Bonnie talks about consolidation, and this is from brain science, is that in order for the brain to consolidate this new neural pathway, it requires practice or rehearsal. And to consolidate really means just to make solid. To make this new coupling solid, we have to practice. And so let's practice. Let me ask for you to think about it, and you and I are going to think about this too, Odie,
Sounds
okay?
good. Mm-hmm.
Can you think of a time when you were taken from above, in the sense of the way we're talking about surprise, a time that you were surprised by grace, by love, instead of judgment, instead of shame? See if you can think of a specific instance. Draw it to mind. I'd recommend you writing it down if you have some way to do that right now, because you can spend some time with this. In fact, you're going to see in a minute that I encourage us to practice this. But let's just check in with each other.
Okay.
Do you mind if I ask you? This isn't prepped, and so I want to ask
No,
you
yeah.
if it's okay.
Yeah.
Can you think of an instance of where you were taken from above, surprised by this? And I'll share one too, and then I'll invite our viewers to reflect themselves on their own experience, and then supply some further instruction of how you might want to work with this to get it consolidated the way that Bonnie talks about.
Yeah, so the one that came to mind for me was when I was probably like early 20s. I took my brother's car to visit some friends that from like an hour away from where we lived at the time. And the tires on the car weren't that good.
Yeah.
And my brother even told me, you probably shouldn't go anywhere because the tires are bad, and I'm going to get it changed over the weekend, so just wait. But me being stubborn and not wanting to wait, I said, that's fine, I'll take it anyways. And it was raining that day really bad. And so what ended up happening, long story short, is I skid off the road, totaled his car. Nothing happened to me, by the grace of God, but his car was totaled. And I was just thinking, he's going to kill me.
Yeah.
And so I had to give him the call. And so I called him. I said, hey, I'm sorry, but I totaled your car.
Oh.
And I was just scared of like what he was going to say and what he was going to think. He's like, all right, well, are you okay? And I was just like, yeah, I'm fine. He's like, all right. And he's like, I think it took me a while to call him too. And he asked me why it took so long. And I told him, because I was afraid of what you were going to think, what you were going to say.
Sure.
And he was just like, well, I can buy another car, but I can't buy another brother.
That's extraordinary.
And, it was, at the time, I was young and didn't know what that meant at the time, like forgiveness.
Yeah.
But now, like, looking back at it now, I realized, like, wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't expect that from him, just given our history, too, and just of how he grew up and kind of had a tough attitude as well. Okay, so just expecting that from him, but that was exactly that.
Yeah.
Take it from him.
It's a beautiful example. It's very touching to me. It's all the more surprising because he had a tough attitude.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not like he was prone to doing that, or you weren't certainly anticipating that. That's why you took a while to report to him. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a beautiful example of the kind of surprise we're talking about. Yeah, yeah. I think it's good that we remember these, and I liked how you put it, that you were young at the time and maybe didn't fully absorb it or appreciate it. And over the years, my guess is it's even more meaningful as you begin to develop more and more of a sense of wisdom and kind of the context of your life and even of your brother's life, and to realize that he was able to extend grace to you despite all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly.
The example that comes to my mind is in some ways parallel in terms of its being surprising. I go back to, in the last 10 years, my moving from active addiction into recovery, and that cusp is never a very pretty one. Mm-hmm. It's like you go to bed one day addicted, the next day wake up recovered. It's like it typically takes some hitting bottom and some relapses, and that certainly was the case for me early on. And like with your brother, from the most surprising place for me, my daughter Amanda, I would in some ways, because I know her so well, I would expect for her to grant grace, and she has, for the addiction and support for my recovery, and I don't take that for granted. But I think here's a surprise for me, is that her mother Tammy, from whom I've been divorced for 30 years. Reached out to me when I was at the very lowest of the low. I mean, I think I was just right out of the hospital. I can still remember when we talked, where it was by phone. She lives out of the area. And she reached out to me with heartfelt encouragement and support and belief in me to be able to get back on my feet again. Right. That moved me. That moved me. Yeah. Because you can well imagine divorce isn't always a really painless process. And while ours has been kind and a lot of love over the years, there's a lot of disappointment and sorrow around having been married for years and years together and then divorced. And then years after we've been together as a couple, for her to reach out to me. And you could say on the one hand, it was loyalty to our shared daughter, Amanda. And that's true. Mm-hmm. That's true. And also what I want to say is this is Tammy reaching out to me as somebody that she cares deeply for, whether we're married or not. Mm-hmm. And that was surprising. Like your brother with you. Right. He just, thank goodness you're okay. I can replace the car. Right. And despite no longer being married to Tammy, she hasn't forgotten who I am and continues to be with me through the darkest night. It'd be easy to brush that off, and she didn't. Mm-hmm. I was surprised by that and deeply touched by that. And that was a huge piece, a huge resource in my own recovery, and I'm grateful for that, as you with your brother.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you. I hope that our viewers today can find examples of that. I don't think it's a given, and you may not have experienced that in your life, but if you have, I think it's valuable to call it to mind just the way that Odie has today and that I am. last week what we did together is we did an exercise that involved gratitude practice, and I encourage you to review last week's presentation. The title of the presentation, as I mentioned earlier, was Integral Recovery Practice, and one element of that was, what would it be like to get up in the morning and just spend some time being thankful and noting what you're thankful for. Odie today, right now, is thankful for his brother's grace. I'm right now thankful for my former wife Tammy's grace, and that's absolutely the case. What would it be like, in the spirit of what Bonnie's saying about consolidating, to actually begin to practice that memory, practice that awareness, and have that become a part of my fiber, my very being. In the spirit of last week's gratitude practice, I shared with you last week that I practice that almost every day and have done so for all of these years of recovery. And I don't know how to go back to what my mindset was like before. I can't go, well, this is how I was 10 years ago or 5 years ago. All I know is this is what I do. And I believe that in the spirit of what Bonnie's saying about railway couplings, I think that over time it changes the way that I'm organized psychologically and spiritually. And I'm very grateful for that. So what we've done today is apply gratitude practice to, I'm going to call them grace givers. Your brother's a grace giver. Tammy, my former wife, is a grace giver. And I'm going to, ever the teacher, I'm going to give you a homework assignment, everybody. Odie, Austin, Bob. That why don't you consider, just for, if you found somebody that you've been able to identify today in our conversation that is one of these grace givers, where you've been surprised, where you've been taken from above, why not make a note, put it in your calendar, make a pop-up in your smartphone, whatever, and just do that for a week. Just revisit this story, your story, Odie, my story with Tammy. Revisit that for a week and just see what that feels like to do that. And if you like how that feels, then you can extend it to another grace giver, and so on. But I don't think you could be doing yourself any harm to even try it for a week. I'd like to suggest that you rehearse this memory that we're talking about, of being surprised, every day for a week. Let me summarize in 4 slides, and I'm going to ask Austin to bring these slides up. The first one is that first one right there. Yeah. The first one is what we talk about. What Bonnie taught me in our supervision is that trauma starts off as a temporary state. You just experience a certain injury psychologically or maybe physically. You experience a certain kind of trauma to your psyche and to your body, and it's an individual experience. It's temporary. That sense of disconnection, of rejection, of being invaded physically or sexually or emotionally, it's a temporary state. But as that recurs, it develops more of a sense of becoming permanent, and that's the sense of this locked together coupling that we're talking about. It's not an individual state, a temporary state, it's a permanent state. And so what we're talking about, and Odie and I are talking about right now, is that you have these individual experiences like with your brother and I with my former wife, where you have an experience of grace where things release a little bit. And maybe it's not enough to get them to release permanently. They go back to the old. Yeah. But there's something that happened with your brother, and even though you were very young, and there's something that happened for me with my former wife, and even though I was very early in recovery, so not in the best shape, it touched me. Yeah. And I probably went back to this, and you might have gone back to this. I won't speak for you. Mm-hmm. But if you have enough recurrence of that, what Bonnie is suggesting is that this will open up and begin to trust, and actually what you get is a new recoupling where instead of trauma, what you have is you have love. Instead of disconnection, what you have is connection, and that actually can become more permanent. And that would be the value for me of prayer, of meditation, some way that we cultivate this latter coupling, that we cultivate more of a permanent stage rather than a temporary state. So I think there is hope here, and the hope, it seems like to me, is moving from the disconnection that Johann Hari, we started today talking about this, it's moving from that sense of disconnection that in his view almost always accompanies addiction, and I wouldn't disagree with him personally, is moving from that there's hope to move from that to the opposite of addiction. And as Johann Hari says, the opposite of addiction is connection. And so I'd like to suggest that we can begin to cultivate this ourselves. This is the amazing thing. Yeah. It's great to have a brother like you have who did what he did. It's great for me to have a former wife, Tammy, who did what she did. And to think that not only do we have the opportunity for those grace givers from outside, but that we can also surprise ourselves from inside by rehearsing that, cultivating that inside. And that's how I think of prayer or meditation as a way of really creating a fertile ground for this to really take deeply. And what grows out of that is vitality. Shame shuts us down. Vitality is the opposite of that. It's a full, vibrant life. And I think that that's really our birthright. Yeah. I really do think. In the Christian tradition, the Latin term is imago Dei. It's the image of God. The image of God is in us. And that image of God is like a template or a stamp of God. That is, as I understand it, is a vitality. My sense of it, I think about this. Odie, I didn't know you when you were 2, but I bet you were just so cute. Oh my gosh. I bet you were. Maybe. And I don't know if I was cute or not, but I was too. Okay. But the sense of it is that when we're young like that, you think of any child that you've been around. I think of my own daughter, and then I think of my 2 grandkids. There's such natural effervescence. There's such natural just presence and curiosity. That I think of as being vitality. And you think then it's just crushing to imagine what could take that birthright away, what could quell that spirit. And all of us have experienced the slings and arrows of life. No parents, no circumstances. Life isn't ideal. We suffer. And part of what suffers is our loss of our vision, our loss of our enthusiasm. Enthusiasm literally means in theos. It means God in you. Theos, God inside of you. Think about it. We lose God inside of ourselves. We lose enthusiasm by virtue of trauma. And we turn towards poor form substitutes for enthusiasm. And for me, that was addictive substances. And for you, that was addictive behaviors, some combination of all of that. And it's nearly universal. 25% of American adults are addicted to substance right now, and 90% say they're addicted to at least one behavior. It's universal. Addiction comes from the Latin root addictus, which simply means slave. We all know about enslavement. So what we're talking about today is how might we be freed from that? How might we be taken from above and freed from enslavement? How might we experience liberation? And I think liberation comes in these moments, like with your brother and like with Tammy, my former wife. And I think it also comes by our rehearsing and cultivating what Bonnie Badenoch is another grace giver in my life, for sure. She talks about it in terms of consolidation. How can I make that one experience become a more permanent state of mind? Well, I need to work on making it solid in my life. And I can do that via prayer and meditation as a start. In addition to hanging out with really grace-giving people. And I know that you have those in your life. You're sitting in a room with 2 of them right now, and vice versa. That I remember my very first session with my therapist all those years ago. I went in bemoaning this and that. And I remember what he said. He said, because I was in a psychology program. I just finished a psychology program. And I looked at everything as interior. I need to work with this and that inside of myself and so on. And I remember him saying, Bob, the real world really matters. It's literally what he said in the first session. And I went, whoa, which means it's really good to hang out with grace-giving people. That's the real world. And then if we can practice internalizing what they give to us, which is being taken from above, that maybe we can begin to experience some of that freedom, that liberation, that vitality ourselves. I feel a little bit like a minister today. I hope that's okay. Do you have any final comments? Are we good?
All that is great stuff. I think for me personally, one of the best things that I have for with my faith is exactly that.
Is it? Okay, good for you.
It's the grace part, and it's difficult sometimes to think about that and to remind myself of, well, I believe in this because of the grace that was given to me, not for something that I did or that I was necessarily worthy or even meant to have, but it's just a free gift, and so I think in hand with that and with the people that have been placed in my life, with the behavior that I had, the addiction that I had, all this came into play to really to help out.
Yeah, thank you, Odie. You make me think of something. So whether one is Christian or some other faith or spirituality, one thing that you'll find in common across the 12-step programs is this belief in a higher power.
Right.
And frankly, for most of the people that I know, that's posited in Christian terms, but it doesn't require that. At least AA and NA in their development don't require that. But it's a relationship to a power greater than ourselves.
Right.
And I know that for me, when you talk about the grace of your brother towards you or the grace of Tammy towards me, that to me is how God moves, is through that grace. Yeah. And I really agree with you. Absolutely. It's sometimes I've heard grace defined as unmerited favor. It's like I crashed your car and you're giving me unmerited favor. That's incredible. Yeah. I crashed my life, and my former wife, who would have no reason to do that, grants me unmerited favor. Yeah. And as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't get much higher power than that. Right, and whether it's Johann Hari talking about connection or us talking about God and higher power, it has immense transformative capacity, it seems like to me.
Absolutely.
And then to think that we can cultivate that in our day-to-day spiritual practice of prayer, meditation, and so on, it really is a grace. There looks like there's one comment up here. Oh, thank you. I love what you're sharing here. So clear and great examples. Thank you, guys.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah. We're done for today, but I want to thank all of you that participated. Austin, thank you. Odie, thank you for being with me today. Really appreciate comments like this. I feel the spirit of those that watch us and participate each week. We've had Angela with us in the last couple of weeks. I have this sneaking suspicion that might be you right now. And whether it isn't or not, your spirit looms large on the horizon, dear Angela. Thank all of you, as symbolized by Angela, that participate regularly with us and take to heart what we're talking about. And, as I mentioned earlier, the real... the deepest value of what we're doing is if someone takes this in and it transforms your life. Preparing for this each week and our contributing like this and having done this for a year, this becomes part of the spiritual practice for me for sure. So I'm grateful to you, Odie, and to Austin, and to Beginnings, and Dr. G, et cetera, for supporting what we do here. And it's wonderful to create a community of those that that join us each week. So really thank you for joining us. Yeah. The last comment, I just see this up here. I'm just going to read this. I think it could be good practice just to just give unconditional positive regard to others as a way of extending this practice. Isn't that true? The psychologist Carl Rogers coined this phrase, unconditional positive regard. He also called it non-possessive warmth. And it's really what you're talking about with your brother. It's unconditional. There's no conditions. You wrecked his car and he has positive regard. I ran off the rails in my own life, and my former wife extended that to me. And so for us to pay this forward, to give to others, the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, I read a book of his years ago called The Miracle of Mindfulness. It was when I was early in my studies around meditation. And I loved how he talked about how it is that mindfulness in action manifests as this that we're talking about. Yeah. Mindfulness in action manifests as, I think he called it charity. It's like charity is giving unconditional positive regard, and it may be the best thing that we can do for our own recovery, for our own transformation, is to give it away. So I don't need to harbor it. It's like the grace that you got from your brother, you give to your wife. Right. You give to other people in your life, and the same for me. And so I agree with that for sure. It's to be passed along. I have to tell you guys, I got up yesterday morning, and in my quiet time, I actually did some reading online in Wikipedia. I looked up the idea of limited good. It comes from cultural anthropology. And it's the idea that many cultures in the world, including our own, feel like that if I give you something, Austin, that means less for me. That's the idea of limited good. And cultural anthropologists study different cultures across the planet, and that's not universal. There are cultures, and they were talking about native cultures, for example, in some of the so-called developing countries, that if I give you something, it's actually more for all of us. So the idea that it's not zero sum. It's like, if I give you something, it's minus for me. +1 for you minus 1 for me equals 0. Well, what if +1 for you equals +1 for me and +1 for Odie? That's a radical notion, it seems like to me, but it ties into what this person just shared with her right here about unconditional positive regard. There's no limit to that. Yeah. It isn't like you can put a cap on love, a cap on grace. And in fact, it's additive. The more I give to you, the more we give to one another, the more we have for ourselves. So it's counterintuitive with this idea that we've got kind of a limited, like we have a little rain barrel of so much grace, and if I give that away, it's dry. It's like the more I give away, the wetter it gets. So
that reminds me of, have you heard of Pay It Forward?
Yeah, I have. Say
Yeah.
something about that. You want to make a comment?
Well, just it's. I know it's a movie, but I don't know how far it goes as far as a movement, but that pretty much what you're just saying. You do something good for somebody, and then they do something good for somebody else, and it's just like a chain reaction.
Yeah, it's built right into the 12-step programs. Is that there were psychologists out of Harvard that studied the 12-step programs. They wanted to see what made them effective, and since they're psychologists, they're not going to be looking at higher power stuff.
Right.
That would be more the province of, let's say, theologians or whatever. So they were looking at psychological factors, and they found 2 key reasons that the 12-step programs are effective, and we've talked about both of them today. One of them is the sense of universality, is that you're with people that understand you. They call that universality. It's universal. And the second one is altruism, which is that in the program, and you know this from your own experience, is that we're asked to give it away. We're asked to give it away, particularly the 12th step. The 12 steps, the 12th step is about giving it away, and that actually the most crucial thing I can do, one of the most crucial things I can do to sustain effective recovery is to give away unconditional positive regard. And so hence you see this kind of sense of generosity that's counseled in the 12-step programs. You find this across the religious traditions of the world, this idea of giving away, literally charity. So yeah, it is very much the idea of paying it forward. It's built right into recovery. Thank you all very much for joining us. If you have any questions or comments after our podcast today, you're welcome to write to Ask an Addiction Specialist, our Facebook group. Austin will forward those to me and to Odie. You can also write me directly at my website, which is drbobweathers.com, and I'll be happy to respond to you there. Thanks for joining us. Come back next week for the next round of Ask an Addiction Specialist. Thank you and have a blessed week. Bye-bye.